Well, good morning again, and let us hope that the gremlins that have been following us this last couple of days. I don't know what it is about a coronation. It seems to affect what is it the parts that other ceremonies it can't affect, and it keeps on affecting us with all sorts of gremlins. But I'm happy to say that at least we have looking at us a renowned author is John Dickie. And good morning, John.
Morning. Can you
We're
hear me?
hearing you perfectly. Yes, it was
wonderful.
something in between. Yes. Well, welcome to Mirador. And
Nice to
you
meet
will be actually in Lewis in the next couple of days speaking at the Speakers Festival about your book or books, which are about the Mafia. Now, perhaps we could hit something on the head, because it is always said in journalistic circles, ha ha ha, we're terribly special, that the Mafia will actually not hurt authors as long as they don't interfere with their business. Myth or reality?
Well, if I've got lots of friends who are journalists who've had the classic bullets in the post, the threats, even attempts on their lives. So that's a genuine problem. Journalists who report on live issues run a risk, and have to keep a lawyer constantly in their pay. Thank goodness, touch wood, historians don't quite run the same risks, because we're working with documentation that is in the public domain. We're not sort of crawling through the gardens of mafia bosses with a telephoto lens or anything like that.
Right. Now, over the being a historian, over the years, the popular understanding of Mafia is that it went from waving of machine guns in Chicago in the 1930s to being very sophisticated and finding its way into all forms of government and business and law and so on. Truth again or fiction?
No, I mean, we have to clear up first that Italy has a number of different mafia organizations, but my talk in Lewis and my next book is about if you like, the best known of those, the most notorious of those, which is the Sicilian Mafia, also known as Cosa Nostra, which is the one which also has a kind of sister organization in the United States. And there has been mafia activity in the United States since at least the 1880s that we know about. The Sicilian Mafia is as old as the Italian state. It's basically born in the turmoil, Garibaldi and all of that leads to the unification of Italy in 1860-61. It's born out of that political violence. And it's born already, often people tell you sort of homespun stories about the origins of the mafia as if it began somehow as part of peasant culture, or this Sicilian mentality that doesn't like outsiders. People want to sort out their own problems. No, the Sicilian mafia has always been what it is now, which is a murderous secret brotherhood bound by oaths and myths, on the model of organization kind of copied from the Freemasons, plagiarized from the Freemasons, if you like, whose core business is extortion, and networking to draw in contacts from the world of politics or the institutions or business or whatever it might be. So there's never been a sort of good old peasant mafia, which was somehow a self-defense society or anything like that. It was born pretty much as it is and has changed remarkably little over the years.
How did you get involved in being a historian for the Mafia?
Well,
About the Mafia.
when I was doing my academic apprenticeship as my PhD, one of the chapters of that was about the very earliest investigation, sociological investigation into the Sicilian Mafia in the mid-1870s. In 1876, these rather brave Tuscan intellectuals set off for kind of darkest Sicily in order to describe what they referred to as the violence industry. And that book is still actually written in the end by a guy called Leopoldo Franchetti, is still consulted by academics interested in the Sicilian Mafia. It's very important and influential. So it was a chapter about that. And then I quickly realized, the years 1992, 1993, when I finished my thesis, were hugely important in the history of the Mafia. These were the years people might vaguely remember in which judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino were blown up by Mafia bombs. And the impact of those attacks is still with us today. Hugely epoch-defining moments. And I realized in the wake of that, really, that people were fascinated by the Mafia outside Italy, but really didn't understand it, simply weren't up to speed with what the latest research was in Italy, historical research as well, because we have a good, narrative, a very convincing document-based narrative of the history of the Sicilian Mafia now, thanks to the research of many experts in Sicily. And that was the history that I reconstructed in my book Cosa Nostra, which came out in about 2003 and went on to sell 1 million copies and be translated all around the world into about 21 languages or something.
Now, as you pointed out in your introductory remarks, is that even the Sicilian Mafia has many tentacles. Do we understand as the general public any better now what the Mafia is? Because I tend to think Mafia is Mafia, but it's far more complex than that.
Well, one of the great lessons of the history of the Mafia is that the word mafia has been dogged by kind of conceptual inflation right through its history. People have always used it as an insult or, defined it in different ways. And there have always been political and cultural arguments, and still are to this day, about the word mafia. But as its core, as I said, the Mafia is structured kind of on the model of the Freemasons. You take an oath to join, swearing loyalty until death to Cosa Nostra. You join a local branch of the Mafia called a family. Now that's a metaphor for the sort of brotherly relationship between the members. It doesn't mean that they're all related. That's the mistake the Godfather made, assuming that it was all about blood relation, family. But that family structure that local family also gives you credentials that give you access to a much wider network of criminal contacts and criminal talent.
Now, I don't know anything, don't know much about the Masons either, but I assume that when you join the Masons, you join as a sort of a novice or something. Now, when you join a Mafia family, do you join as a novice, or can you go in halfway through, or What's the form?
It depends who you are. Generally speaking, if you're, as it were, you don't have blood relations in the Sicilian mafia, you tend to be watched very carefully. You're usually required to commit a murder before you're admitted. You've got to demonstrate your trustworthiness through a number of ways, perhaps by undergoing a prison sentence, or, there are all sorts of ways to judge people's criminal caliber. If you are the son of a mafioso, and as it were, your family background shows that you are likely to be trustworthy, then that may provide a kind of shortcut to initiation, if you like, and you can be initiated much younger. You can be initiated much younger. So it depends, really. You can be either sort of a blue-blooded mafioso or a newcomer, a barrow boy. And sometimes people are even initiated almost as a flattering move because they can be useful to the organization. Before the First World War, we have the record of the initiation of a mafia doctor, who was useful because he could sign certificates that would keep mafiosi out of being enlisted into the army in the First World War. So they very much wanted him on board. And similar things can happen with people who are useful for one reason or another.
Now, does the barrow boy ever rise to the top, or is it a blue blood situation within the family?
Yeah, we had the most powerful boss of all time, and the man who ultimately became responsible for the downfall of the Sicilian mafia, because that's the story that I'm really concentrating on in my talk, was a barrow boy. He was a peasant thief who was recruited from Corleone, and his name was Salvatore Riina. Curto is known as Shorty. And he became effectively a kind of military dictator of the Sicilian mafia in the 1980s, and embarked on what was ultimately clearly a crazy strategy of directly confronting the Italian state.
Now, you've said that the thrust of your talk is about the downfall, if you like, of the Sicilian mafia. You've said that it started really in the mid-1800s. When was its great surge of power? When was it the most powerful?
I think it's been powerful all along. As I said, very early on, it has a powerful conditioning effect over the economy, over politics, over the institutions. The intermittent efforts to repress it only end up demonstrating how deeply rooted it was. Under fascism, there were one or two efforts to get rid of it, but in the end, the fascist regime preferred to just kind of ban all talk of the word mafia from the newspapers and sort of pretend the problem had gone away. I would have thought the high point would be the late 1970s, when the Sicilian mafia is, two mafiosi, for example, are running Italy's tax collection franchise and taking a 10% take of all the taxes collected, when the Sicilian mafia is the main supplier of heroin into the Atlantic coast of the United States, when it has friends deeply and very, very high up in Italian politics, including a man who would in the end be 7 times prime minister of Italy, Giulio Andreotti. So that was I don't think it ever reached such a peak. And that peak turned out to be, if you like, the preface to the phase of dramatic decline that we've seen in recent years. The Sicilian Mafia today is in the worst crisis of its 160-year history.
All right, I will come back to that in a moment. One other question I'd like to ask you is, why did it export to the United States?
Well, one key reason was that the Sicilian Mafia, I mentioned that its core business was extortion rackets. Okay, the simple business of parasitically taking a kind of tax in return for safety, in return for not attacking any aspect of the economy, whether it be a car thief or the owner of a car showroom. Both in theory have to pay protection money to the Sicilian Mafia. And the most valuable part of the Sicilian economy in the middle of the 19th century was lemons. The lemon groves around Palermo. Sicily had a virtual natural monopoly on citrus fruit in that period in history. And this citrus fruit was extremely important for, the British Navy needed it for, avoiding scurvy. Citric acid was used for various industrial purposes. So it's hugely lucrative. Sicily, the area around the Sicilian capital, Palermo, was some of the richest, most profitable agricultural land in the world. And that's where those extortion rackets were first established. And of course, the lemons, a lot of those lemons made their way across to the United States. And with them went the mafiosi who were profoundly immersed in the citrus fruit economy. Then, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, you have a colossal wave of emigration, transatlantic emigration. About a quarter of Sicily's population emigrated to the United States in the sort of decade and a half up to the start of the First World War. And among those groups were mafiosi. So, it's basically that phase. And from that point on, it becomes a kind of transatlantic criminal system where you get mafiosi being able to run away from law enforcement on one side of the Atlantic by going to the other, where you even get people going across the Atlantic to perform murders and then jumping on a steamship and going back where they couldn't be found. All of that, a constant exchange over the next century, at least, in criminal talent, criminal commodities like narcotics. Again, that starts to happen very quickly. Arms, criminal talent, ideas, all sorts of things.
So it wasn't sort of a bunch of Sicilian mafiosi going to the United States and knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, chaps, we're moving in on your territory." It was sort of a slow process of takeover, if you like.
Well, again, quite surprisingly fast in certain sectors of the economy, like citrus fruit, wholesale fruit and vegetable markets, for example. And Italy became a very useful place, for example, for the mafia's counterfeiting business. You could counterfeit dollars in Italy where nobody was particularly interested and export them to the United States. That kind of activity. And then, of course, the huge numbers of Sicilians in the little Italies of the east coast of the United States became sort of water for the mafiosi to swim in. They could extort money from them, from their businesses, the same sort of parasitic activities that they'd carried on back in the old country.
Right. Let's turn now then to the thrust of your book, which is that this golden era came to an end,
Yeah.
or is disintegrating. First of all, is it terminal? And if it's not, what is modern mafia doing to try and restore their power?
Yeah. I don't think it's terminal. For as long as we have a kind of international narcotics market fueled by our obsession with the war on drugs and with, you know, sort of banning and trying not to think about narcotics, then there will be a criminal market ready for actors to emerge. But the Sicilian Mafia, as of today, has been largely cut out of international criminal markets. It can't boast the same sort of contacts in politics and the establishment that it once had. It finds it much, much, much more difficult to corrupt law enforcement, and you know, than it used to. Its territorial structure, that structure of families, each of which takes the name of a particular area of Palermo or of a town in the hinterland, whatever it might be, has been profoundly disrupted. Its hierarchy, it's very important. The mafia has a hierarchy. It has, when it's working well, a commission, what's called the commission or the cupola, which is a kind of supreme court of the Sicilian mafia in some ways, a coordinating body. And the reason that's important, that coordinating body, is that mafias are territorial animals. Yeah, each mafia family rules a particular territory, and they will tell you exactly where on which road their territory begins and ends. But business often crosses that territory. If the government's building a road that crosses through 4 or 5 mafia territories, they need to get together to decide how the protection money is going to be distributed between them. And for that, they need a body to give rulings. And the last time that body, commission, managed to meet successfully was in 1993. And they've tried 4 times since then to reform the commission. And since then, every time they've all been watched and filmed and arrested. That is a sign of profound crisis in this territorial structure of the Sicilian Mafia, which is crucial. It really is what it's about. So the crisis is there. You know, the number of mafia murders has dropped off a cliff. You know, it's 1, 2, 0 a year. When for most of history, the documentation's unreliable. We're talking 50, 100 a year. That is the symptom of a profound, profound crisis. And my book is about how that happened. But just as importantly, and I should say this is a book I haven't written yet. I'm embarking on, I'm discussing it. I've got the contracts for it. I know my Italian publisher is particularly interested in this book, and they think it's a book that badly needs to be written. And the reason they think it's bad to be written is that nobody in Italy wants to talk about this decline in the Sicilian Mafia. People really, I mean, it's almost superstitious in some respects. People's reluctance to talk about that the Sicilian Mafia is in a really, really bad way. And the police and investigators have been doing a great job for the last 30 years or so.
Well, if I was Sicilian Mafia, and I felt that the public were almost sympathetic in that sense, it would be the time to pounce, to actually start a resurgence. Any evidence of that?
It's not that the public is sympathetic. Far from it, in fact. Hostility, you know, mafia is regarded, you know, various opinion polls and things have been taken anecdotally that say that in Sicily, calling somebody a mafioso is worse than calling them a paedophile. You know, hostility, a visceral hostility to the mafia, and a desire to commemorate the atrocities and the horrors that the mafia perpetuated is almost a kind of civic religion in Sicily now. Everywhere you go, there are monuments, there are research institutes. People, you know, the public discourse in Sicily is constantly on about the mafia problem and the need to defeat the mafia. So it's certainly not that the public is sympathetic. The mafia really is no longer in control of its own destiny. It is struggling. The forces of law and order and have their foot on its neck, and they certainly don't want to take that off. That's one of the reasons why they're nervous about saying anything that might be interpreted as implying that the mafia is dead and they can all relax. That's certainly not what I'm saying. There is the potential for a resurgence. But the way that we're going, the Sicilian mafia is really, really in a bad way. There are weirder, stranger reasons in Sicily why people won't talk about it. While you'll much rather hear, oh no, the mafia now, it's so profoundly, you know, it's become the state. The mafia, the reason that it's no longer killing people, it doesn't have to, because it's learned to do business in a very quiet, subtle way. The conspiracy theories abound about the mafia, how the mafia threw everybody an extravagant dummy and pretended to be defeated, and so on and so forth. And so and there's also a kind of legacy of bitterness from the past. There are many, many injustices, many lingering mysteries from the time when the mafia was very, very powerful. We don't know the full truth still about certain atrocities and crimes that were committed, and that has left this lingering sense that something called the mafia is still with us. In a lot of cases, what people mean is corruption. Corruption has expanded to fill the void left by the retreat of the mafia. And also, I think there have been a number of scandals where people have posed as champions of the anti-mafia, who've, you know, said all the right things in public about the fight against the mafia, while actually in private being on the take. And a number of scandals of that kind have emerged. More, you know, that they appear with sickening regularity these days in Sicily.
But those people who are playing both ends against the middle, are their lives in danger? I mean, if they put a foot wrong, are they one side or the other going to get them?
No, well, I think the fact that they're doing that shows that actually people really in the know aren't that afraid of the mafia anymore. Well, what they're risking is going to prison, which is what happens to them when their cases of corruption come to light.
Tell me, forgive me if I use a business allegory, but you look at the World Economic Forum, which supports globalization of industry and you know, this massive expansion, and you can even see that to some extent in even local communities where, I mean, for instance, our health service has gone from a tiny little surgery to now embracing 10 or 12 surgeries and so on. Now, from what you say, is there has been in the past this, yes, let's look after one another. Could you see a resurgence of mafia under sort of the idea of globalization?
Golly, I mean, it depends what you mean by mafia, and it depends what you mean by globalization. Honestly, I think that Reagan's a bit. Forgive me, but for saying, but I think the question's a bit vague to for me to respond to in a useful way. I mean, globalization has been with us for a long, long time. It's not a new thing. We're all kind of interconnected, whether it by be by climate, disease, trade, invasions, migrations. All of that is the stuff of human history, and so too is sort of has been criminal activity for a long time. One of the aspects, of course, is the international nature of criminal markets. Cocaine produced in South America, making its way into Europe, creates a huge and lucrative opportunity, just as in the way that heroin or opium produced in the Golden Triangle, making its way through Turkey and into southern Europe and so on, and then across the Atlantic, created different criminal opportunities at different stage of the chain. That's as much globalization as the spread of ideas and the huge economic opportunities that it's opened up and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, you have to try and fight the bad and support the good, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, forgive me for putting those in broad terms, but I spent a number of years both as a student and then a journalist in Vancouver, in British Columbia, where I as a journalist, I got to know the quote Mafia quite well, where the head honcho was called Bill Robertson. No sort of Sicilian names or whatever. But the basic structure, and I'm talking about the 1970s now, and you said so the golden era was the 1980s, so building towards it, was that they came under the Buffalo family, who didn't, Vancouver wasn't big enough for them to take on into the franchise, but they weren't willing to let it go. So what they did was they parceled it out until such time as it was. So, I mean, that showed a real tentacle situation.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the metaphor of tentacles. That's a bit, I mean, it's very evocative, and it's the kind of thing that good journalists write.
I'm not sure.
It's more in terms of credentials and recognition and that sort of thing. There's a famous phone tap from rather it's a kind of bugging operation by the Mounties in Montreal in the mid-70s, which is of two mafiosi, one from Sicily, one based in Canada, who are arguing about whether the mafia credentials you get in Sicily are valid when you get to the United States. It's a very arcane, what seems like an arcane thing, as in the sort of thing that if you're a lawyer in London and then you go to Australia or India, are your credentials valid? Yeah, that's what they're arguing about. And the reason they're doing that is because for all sorts of political and greed related reasons. But the politics of mafia networks are like that. They're formalistic. They care a lot about these credentials and the structures and who they recognize as a mafioso and who they don't. That is it's the formal side of mafia power, internal power politics.
Right. We've been going for half an hour, and fascinating half an hour it is. Just if I ask you to look into a crystal ball, and you came back here in 5 years' time, what would you say were the waves, if you like? Where would Mafia have gone in that 5 years, based on what you have is a very, very deep and specific knowledge, which most people don't have. So how do you see, quote, the future, if you like?
Yeah, remember, I'm talking strictly about the Sicilian mafia, not
Right.
any of Italy's other mafia organizations, which I also know a lot about, and where the picture is much less rosy, depending on where you go, or about any, because, you know, mafia is a bit like Hoover. You know, it's a word that has become applied all around the world to various forms of organized crime. But I'm talking about the original, if you like, the Sicilian mafia. I like to think that in 5 years' time, the current trends will have continued, that the pattern of grinding down the mafia's operations will continue. And I'd like to think, actually, that Italy, Sicily, more generally, the world will start to have a conversation about where we are now that the Sicilian mafia has been crippled.
So,
and what to do next.
yeah. Who, if you, supposing you were put in charge of this, who would you embrace into having these sort of conversations?
Well, Italy has a lot of the problem is that the mafia is too good an enemy to let go easily. Yeah. If politicians, when people, you know, UKIP or whatever, rail against the establishment or the monster of the European Union in this country, in Sicily, populists looking for an easy enemy to kind of get people's blood racing, talk about the mafia. And they use the mafia in the vaguest possible terms to mean corruption, the state, the deep state, the whatever it happens to be, in order to win political consensus and shape the debate in the way that populists do. That's a big part of the problem in Sicily, is the easy populist rhetoric about the fight of the mafia. And that's what I think people have to learn to see through. And those are the people, if you like, who have to be excluded from the debate, or their hold over people's imaginations has to be loosened.
And you're trying to shake that tree.
I hope so, yeah. Wish me luck. I mean, it's going to a lot of polemic. When I've got lots of friends in law enforcement in Italy, and when I told one of my friends who's a senior officer in the Carabinieri about this plan book, he said, "Watch out." And he didn't mean that the mafia was going to get me. He meant that I was going to attract a lot of fire from the kind of populists.
Point of view, right? Well, John, absolutely fascinating half hour. Now, you're coming to Lewes. Is it Saturday?
Yeah, Saturday. I forget the exact time of the talk. I think people ought to know, so I'm going to get it on my get it up on my diary.
Well,
yeah, it looks like about 2:20. I'm talking.
Yes, Saturday the 13th of May at 14:20. Indeed. So here's your opportunity to urge people to come.
Yeah. You can also, if you're really keen, you can also do revision by looking at my history of the Sicilian Mafia, Cosa Nostra. This is the one that sold all those copies, and the reason why I'm returning after 20 years to this subject, to kind of that I'm so passionate about, to you know, see what the state of play is today.
Well, I'm sure that you'll get a very good audience for this particular talk. You're quite right. I mean, it is evocative, and it does give rise to all sorts of stories, particularly from journalists who are notorious for being tellers of tall tales. But perhaps in this particular instance, in selling your books, that's not going to be a bad thing.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I like to think that that my books don't fuel the sort of morbid mafia industry.
Well, we look forward to having you in Lewis. I hope you enjoy your visit here, and I certainly hope that a lot of people turn out to listen to what you have to say, because I found it quite fascinating.
I'm
and
looking forward to it.
You specifically are talking about sort of the perhaps downfall is too strong a word, but the change in status, shall we say?
I've called it the strange death of the Sicilian mafia.
Ah, that's evocative. Thank you very much for being with us.
Not at all.
And we wish you success on Saturday.
Thank you.
Right, you are. John Dickie, and the book festival is in All Saints Centre, and it's been very successful so far. This is one of the authors that you can hear there, and we urge you to take advantage of it. Let's see, it's now it's 10:07, and we'll take a little break before we come back and have another final chat before we all go back to bed, back to sleep. Well, we seem to have overcome the bugs, thank goodness. So let's say toodle pip for the moment, and we'll see you in 10 or 15 minutes. Toodle, toodle, toodle pip.